So I'm very pleased to welcome Torsten Schulten. Torsten is the head of collective agreements of the Collective Agreements Archive of the Institute of Economic and Social Research, or WSE, at the Hans Buchler Stiftung, and that's the German Trade Union Institute. Those of you who know something about Germany may know that you have a lot of these Stiftungen for different political parties, for the employers associations, and for the trade unions. And these institutes really play an important role in informing public policy, but also informing some of the strategies and collective bargaining of unions and works councils in Germany. He's also an honorary professor at the Eberhard Karls Universität of Tübingen. And I'm particularly happy to introduce Torsten because I've known Torsten. I think we first met when I was doing my PhD in Germany. Spent a year there back in the early 2000s, and Torsten was one of many colleagues, but I think he stood out among the colleagues who really were teaching me about the German model to understand German industrial relations, German labor law, German institutions, and what social democracy meant there. And so it's very nice that now Ian Greer and I, who are both in Germany at the same time, are able to return some of that hospitality and having Torsten here and helping him to make sense of US industrial relations and what's left of our democracy. And I guess another thing to say about Torsten is that he has done research in a wide range of areas. So he has focused on sectoral bargaining, union wage politics, and has looked at different industries within Germany and Britain about, for example, the public sector, the meat industry, healthcare, manufacturing. So has this broad cross-industry knowledge and expertise. But the real area that he's focused on over the past, I would say, decades maybe now, maybe just a decade and a half, are the minimum wages in Germany and Europe. And so Germany first got a minimum wage in 2015, so relatively late, or certainly much later than the US. And that was after a very long trade union campaign. And Torsten and the WSE played a really important role in supporting this campaign with research, publications, a lot of media work, talking to journalists, all of these different kinds of things. I still remember him giving a talk at LSE before the minimum wage was passed about some of these campaign strategies and the way that the union was really trying to counteract a lot of the arguments made by German economists who collectively signed a very long document saying we should not have a minimum wage, it will harm our economy. So having this alternative voice of researchers explaining why minimum wages were not going to damage the German economy was quite important. And of course, their analysis and predictions were held up and the economists were not. And I think that is important to kind of think about this model of connecting research and organizing with policy change. I emphasize that because we also have some of our MS labor research and policy students who are figuring out how to navigate those differences. So Torsten's presentation today really reflects on this expertise and is focusing, as you see, on minimum wages and now some of the debates that are happening at the European level, which is also an area that he's worked on. And we're very happy that he can be here to share that knowledge with us.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. And as we say in German, Ginny, danke für die Blumen. Thanks for the flowers. And thanks, of course, for raising the expectations to my talk. That's what I had to do. So I hope I will fulfill that. Yeah, thanks for having me. I must say I'm a little bit sad at the moment because it's already my last week here in Cornell. I stayed for 3 months, and I must say I enjoy the time a lot with also many of you, getting in touch and getting knowing of you. So thanks again for having me here at the Cornell University and for having that good time. I would say I also learned a lot, especially, of course, about American industrial relations, but maybe also about how we could jointly further on continue our cooperation. So yeah, today I want to talk about, so the big thing, is there a paradigm shift to social Europe? But more specifically, and I want to talk about the so-called European Minimum Wage Directive, about its meaning, its impact, and yeah, what it's all about. I basically have 3 points to talk. So first, I want to give you a short overview of what this minimum wage directive is about, and in particular, why I see it really as a paradigm shift regarding social and labor policy in Europe. Secondly, I will go a little bit into, so I will mainly focus not so much on the minimum wage side, but more on collective bargaining and on the attempts to strengthen collective bargaining in Europe. So I will say about something of the current bargaining coverage between 12 and 100%, why it is so different in Europe. Thirdly, I will say a little bit about different ways how to increase the bargaining coverage. And finally, I will also give some thoughts about the US, reflecting these against the background which I had here to see how I understood now and how I see the US system. Well, that's the program. So whenever you feel you don't understand something or wanted to go in, please just feel free to put in questions. So I will always continue to these things. So I start with the European Minimum Wage Directive, but before that, of course, if we talk about social policy or social Europe in more general, and I think the guys who are studying at the Institute for European Studies will, of course, probably know that. I think there is a widespread agreement about the analysis of how the European Union is functioning and how European integration is functioning. And that led to what the famous German political science Fritz Scharf called the structural asymmetry of between negative and positive integration. So the European Union, especially since the 1980s, is all about market creating, the creation of the single market, about economic integration. And here we have a process which is going further and further and try, as I said, to integrate the markets, which of course led to, from a labor point of view, to structural weakening of labor, because now labor and national labor relation systems are set into competition to each other, and companies, economic actors, could use this integrated market to play systems against each other. And the whole liberalization policy coming from the EU is to a large extent also undermining national social standards. So this is a structural weakening thing. On the other hand, the idea of social Europe is, of course, a little bit to compensate this weakening, this liberalization process, through the creation of new European standards, European-wide standards, or the positive integration. But this is, of course, a very difficult task to do, because on the one hand, the national systems are very different, so it's not easy, and it's even not possible just to harmonize them. And there is also a political dominant form of political governments, which we might call an intergovernmental governance form. So the states, or the council with all the now 27 member states, they have to decide on social standards, and in many things they also have to decide autonomously. So there are a lot of veto power from single governments. So it's a very difficult thing to do. So that the potential strengthening of union powers through new European standards are giving this structure of the European integration rather unlikely. So that's the background, I would say, also the theoretical background for my talk. And if we look now to more specifically to the traditional neoliberal view on minimum wages and collective bargaining, as it has been for a long time developed and seen also in European policy, it is the classical thing, you mainly take with minimum wages and collective bargaining as a constraint to the adaptability and to the flexibility of capital. It is seen mainly under the head of competitiveness, so too high minimum wages might lead to less competitiveness. And we saw, especially during the Euro crisis and the debt crisis in the end of the 2000s and the beginning of the last decade, what you might call even a radicalization of this neoliberal approach, insofar as you probably all remember these, in particular, these Troika programs against Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, where really national governments were asked by the European Commission, by the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund was also involved in that, to freeze or cut minimum wages, to decentralize collective bargaining systems. And this is a quote from that time very famous labor market report from the European Commission, to overall reduce the wage setting power of trade unions. So they're literally, there was once a time, so usually, of course, they don't say it that open, but there was one report where they say it that open, and of course, this makes a lot of scandal. And the unions were against it and saying, you always talk about social Europe, and how could you say you want to reduce the trade union power? And then, of course, the European unions, the European Commission guys said, yeah, well, this was just a description. This was not a normative thing. And so they tried to get, but nevertheless, they said it. And I think the report is still available at the web. So feel free to read it yourself. So that was a way of thinking. But this way, especially how the European Union was handling this big crisis at the beginning of the 2010s, creates a lot of problem and really, the development was really a deep crisis of legitimation of European Union. We saw all over Europe growing influence of anti-European far-right stuff. We had probably the Brexit as the most obvious sign of this crisis of the European Union. So policymakers, both at national and European level, think we have to do something that in order to stabilize the support and legitimation of this European integration project. And I think against that background, it was that the what I might call the rediscovery of social Europe played a role. That they said, yeah, well, we simply have to find political project where ordinary people, working class people in Europe say, well, the European Union is doing something good for us and not the opposite. So, and that leads to a debate. It was, I think, first of all, the so-called Juncker Commission. Jean-Claude Juncker said, we need a triple-A for social Europe, so for social things. So that was his speech. So before we were only discussing about triple-A, about, of course, the rating and companies, and now we have been talking about triple-A for social Europe. And then one of the first major thing was, of course, in 2017, the adoption of the so-called European Pillar of Social Rights. These are all nice sounding social rights with no binding character at all. So it was just, you might say, a gentleman's agreement, but nevertheless, it was something where the European Union said, we have to go forward and we have to understand that we have to change this way of the European integration. And finally, it led to even to a more concrete action plan, social rights action plan from 2019 on, where since then we saw a couple of quite progressive social directives, social attempts for social regulation at the European level. And probably the most important in that context is the European Minimum Wage Directive. The European Minimum Wage Directive was adopted in 2022. And it's interesting if you remember what I said before, how the European Union was dealing with minimum wages and collective bargaining. It's now totally the opposite. So at least in the discourse, it's shifted totally towards now we're saying, yeah, minimum wages and collective bargaining are good things for social reasons, are good for economic reason, are even good for political reason in order that it stabilize society in times of crisis. And all the crises we saw since 2019, then also with the COVID crisis, and then all the international multiple crises coming together, they all, I would say, even increase that feeling. We need to do things which stabilize society, basically. And therefore, the social plays an important role. And I would say the paradigm shift here is that indeed, suddenly minimum wages and collective bargaining are basically seen as something positive, which has to be developed, which has to be increased to strengthen, and so on. And interestingly, this was not only the European Union which is saying that, but we had, okay, this is one advertisement thing where I developed that a little bit more in detail, how this shift and this change of argumentation regarding minimum wage was go. But I want to make aware of you that this new way of thinking on minimum wages and collective bargaining was not exclusively to the European Union. There were also other institutions who demonstrate that change. And one very important was, of course, the OECD. So the OECD was for a long time the neoliberal think tank. They were only talking about decentralization of collective bargaining. They had these famous employment, what that's called, employment guidelines in the 1990s. And this was a pure neoliberal agenda. And since the mid-2000s, I would say, they totally changed that view. And they become to a much more differentiated, I would say even positive view on minimum wages and collective bargaining. And probably the report which shows these most clearly is a report on negotiating up the way, I think it's from 2019, where they even themselves reflect about this change of their policy. You might even see, if it comes to, especially to collective bargaining, you might even see that there are, even in the Anglo-Saxon world, you find a lot of examples where, for a kind of strengthening of, some scholars even call it a revival of sectoral bargaining. You find these debates and approaches in the UK, in New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. In some Latin America, especially Chile, try to develop or is under the process of really reforming fundamentally its collective bargaining system. And even the US, but there I come later. I come later to the US point. So just to make you aware, this seemed to be part of an international debate. I just want to refer to a special issue of the international labor law, the last issue of last year, which also focused on this revival of multi-employer bargaining. So, yeah, a little bit more about what is the European Minimum Wage Directive about. It's basically about two things: promotion of adequate minimum wage levels and promotion of collective bargaining. Starting very briefly about brief things about the character and about what they talk about minimum wages, but I will make it only very briefly because I will largely focus on the collective bargaining part. So first of all, there was quite a tricky thing, since it was not clear at all if the EU has, or whatever, the competence to make such a directive. And it's even not finally decided. There will be a final judgment on the 11th of November this year by the European Court of Justice about these. So I was lucky to give my talk before, because when I made this thing, it was not sure when the court was deciding. I was said, oh God, that would be a nice talk to talk about something which the court may have killed already. So that would be not that nice. So I'm lucky. And it is also, I think, very much an open question, but there are many scholars and also, of course, a lot of political forces, of course, who really are against this directive and want to kill it. So they made this argument that the European Union has no competences whatsoever on determining wages and things on collective bargaining, while the official argumentation, justification for the directive is a little bit more tricky. It accept the issue that the EU has no competence to determine wage levels. So the European Minimum Wage Directive is not about determining a certain minimum wage level. So what it's mainly about is procedural rules. So how to set up a European, what they call it, an adequate European minimum wage, so that it has to be based on evidence, that it has to be based on certain criteria, and that there is a regular procedure, how to adjust minimum wages and so on. And of course, they gave some, but these are more recommendations, what adequate minimum wage might be about. And the most clear is a recommendation they gave is what they call to recommend to use the so-called indicative reference values used at the international level, such as 60% of the gross median wage or 50% of the gross average wage. Can I finish that point, or you are?
I just have a question about about the criteria.
Yeah, then wait 1 second, and then I give you the second, because I wanted to show you what that would mean if you have these criteria, 60% of the median wage and 50% of the average wage. You can see here the figures on the minimum wages in different European countries. I also include Canada and the US compared to the median and the average wage. And here you see the thresholds. So according to these are figures from the OECD as well. There are only 2 countries which so far fulfilled these criteria, which are France and Slovenia. But for all the other countries, to fulfill these criteria would mean a significant increase of the minimum wage. And we see that also in many national debates, many national struggles, that the unions and other forces using this European Minimum Wage Directive are pushing very much for a much higher structural increase of minimum wages. So your question.
Here in Ithaca, we talk about it not in relation to setting minimum wages, not in relation to other people's wages, but rather in relation to the cost of living. So that's the living wage concept. I'm wondering if that was ever discussed in this discussion.
It was also discussed in that discussion, and it is not that explicit. I mean, there is one criteria taking the cost of living into account. That is a very general one, but nevertheless, it gives an open space also to use this kind of living wage criteria. And it was also pretty clear that this concept only works, let's say, for societies which have at least functioning welfare state and functioning structure. There are, of course, if you look for countries outside of the EU, I mean, they might have a minimum wage where the median wage of percentage of the median wage of 70, 80, even higher percent. So for countries where you have a very large low wage sector, and in particular, you even have a large informal sector, because these criteria, at least on its own, would not work. So it is more a kind of pragmatic approach, which were taken by the European Commission, but since the calculation, how to calculate a living wage. So I think probably we have 27 different definitions in Europe, how to calculate that and to make it. And it would be very difficult here to come to one single calculation. So it is there as an additional criteria, but that's a more pragmatic one. And I would say, as you see for the figure for Europe, it would work because it would mean a substantial increase in minimum wages for most European countries. So, right.
Part of where the living wage becomes so important in the US is there's an extreme difference in wages between urban areas and rural areas. And people can't get all the way from rural areas to urban areas because we're so spread out. Is that gap much less?
There is I would say there is a significant gap. of course, the cost of living are in higher cities much higher than especially the housing prices, of course. But this is not reflected in that debate. So it is really, I mean, it was difficult enough to make them agreeing at least on these criteria, which I also have to say they are not binding criteria. So this is the legal tricky thing. So it is not that the European Union say you must fulfill it. It is a kind of strong recommendation. And we see in the policy of many national, not all, but most European countries, we see that these criteria are used and taken in the national debate. So it become effective. But yeah, it of course solves not all the problem, including the one you made, the differentiation between the high costs of living in especially larger cities and the urban area and so on. Yeah. So this is all left to the national, of course, and still to the national level to solve these problems. Well, so yeah, that's about the minimum wage. But the thing I wanted to talk about more in detail is about promotion of collective bargaining. And so first of all, it is the principal aim of the directive to increase the strength. It was interesting that because from the beginning, when the Commission made its first proposal for such a directive, it was only about minimum wages. And then you might say that, or you could say, I think, it was really a success of the European Union Confederation to bring in collective bargaining, to say it makes no sense if you talk about minimum wages only to talk about statutory minimum wages. But we really need, because the real minimum wages are determined in collective bargaining. So they were the one emphasizing, and successfully, I must say, emphasizing to bring in collective bargaining into that. So, so the aims again are largely procedural, largely quite general. So they say, of course, strengthening the capacity of social partners, in particular at sector and cross industry levels. So it is already seen that the sectoral level bargaining is the aim or the goal behind this directive. And of course, the protection of workers' union representatives. And the most concrete thing is that it asks, so the directive asks every EU member state which have a collective bargaining coverage below 80% at the moment, to set up a concrete action plan with clear timeline and concrete measures on how to increase collective bargaining coverage in the various countries. And this should be, of course, reviewed regularly and updated, made public to the Commission. So what the directive is basically about is not about saying you have to do this and that concrete measure or instrument to increase collective bargaining, but you have to set up a procedure, a process, a political process, where at least you have a kind of permanent political debate about setting up these action plans. And what that means concrete, I will tell you a little bit in the second part. So what is the current status of collective bargaining in Europe? If you just look for the average development in Europe, we see a decline from, let's say, from the early 90s, where we still had, on average in the European Union, more than 80%. So there, the 80% goal, if you want to say so, of the directive was still fulfilled. And it goes down quite continuously. And it's now about still two-thirds of the workers are covered. But if you look a little bit more closely to the different countries, you see this really great and big variety between 100% in countries like Belgium and Italy and 12% in Poland. One side remark about the figures. The figures comes from the OECD, which took over this database, which was originally developed by the University of Amsterdam. And so these are all not standardized, not harmonized figures. They are all national figures taken from national institutions, national service, and so on. The OECD also officially call them estimations. And in some cases, we already discussed it, for instance, Italy, 100%. It's a thing which you might discuss, whether this is the case or not. Maybe we can do that in the discussion. But I think that's important to have in mind, that these figures are sometimes also questioned, but it gives you a rough picture on the big differences. And if you look to these 80% criteria, we would say we would have at the moment 17 states with a coverage of below 80%. So they are obliged now until the end of this year to set up such an action plan for the increase of national action plan for the increase of collective bargaining coverage. And we have 10 states which are above, but where you also might question the figures. For instance, I know from Denmark and Slovenia that there are also some critical voices saying, well, these figures are too high and probably we are below the 80% and we also would need to do such an action plan. So that's the general picture. The interesting question is, of course, what explains these huge differences in Europe? And as a trade unionist, I am, of course, the first thing you would think about, it's about trade union strengths, strengths, the power of labor, which might see that. So here you see countries, you have the bargaining coverage on the one hand and the union density on the other hand. And I would say you have mainly three clusters. You have two clusters where you either have low coverage and a low union density, and these are the exceptional cases of, in particular, the Nordic states, high coverage and high union density. And then you have a third cluster, which are countries which have rather low or moderate union density, but still a very high bargaining coverage. So you see that there are some groups of countries where union strength and bargaining coverage seem to be quite fine, and you have a third group where it is different. Yeah, please.
What does low union density and high collective bargaining coverage means? For example, France, Austria, Italy.
Now, France, for example, you have less than 10% people in a union, but you have a 90% bargaining coverage.
And I'm asking, what does the coverage means? Is that all expansion orders?
That of course, I will explain that in the coming slides why that is the case. But coverage means, simply speaking, that workers are covered, in that case, usually by sectoral collective agreements. It says nothing about the quality of the agreements, and so that I know that there are different difficult debates also behind these kind of figures. It's just a very rough description covered by collective agreements and members of the unions, and what the relation is here. So you see these three clusters, and of course the interesting one is the cluster with the countries with a high coverage and a low union density. And here I think there are basically two things you have to put in mind. The first is, of course, the dominant bargaining level. Okay, roughly speaking, we have countries where the dominant level is sectoral level, where the dominant level is a company level, and we have some countries which are a little bit mixed, where it's not so clear whether it is more, but you actually have both forms, and it's not a clear dominant model. But you see really at a glance that all the countries with a high bargaining coverage have sectoral bargaining as a dominant level. And I would say that's also, I think that's probably an established fact also in international comparative industrial relations research. You only will get a majority of people under collective bargaining if you have sectoral bargaining. All the other systems we only have a minority of workers, including the US, but I will come back to that as well. So the bargaining level is, of course, very important. I think in addition to the bargaining level, the second thing is also quite important, And this is the state support for sectoral bargaining or for high bargaining coverage. And here we basically have two systems. We have, on the one hand, the exceptional systems of the Nordic state with the Ghent system, where unions are running the unemployment, most of the unemployment funds. And this creates an incentive for workers to become a union member because they have got usually better conditions for unemployment insurance. So this is something which helps these high, still exceptional high union density in Nordic states. And probably the more common system is the extension of collective agreement or other functional equivalents of a quasi erga omnes regulation or a quasi extension of collective agreements. Extension means, for instance, you have an agreement at a sectoral level, which is valid for the agreement parties, but then the state goes and extend this agreement towards the entire sector. So that's basically about. And you see again, all the countries with a high bargaining coverage have some form of state support. So it's never only the unions by themselves who are creating this high coverage. It's always the state who plays a role in these.
This is a great presentation. It's super interesting. But before you get too far away from those countries that have high coverage, low union density, I just wanted to ask, I've looked at France over the years, and it's just, we of course rightfully have always this focus on bargaining coverage, but I found it disturbing that union density seems to be downplayed. I think it makes a qualitative difference, particularly when it comes to stabilizing countries. And the focus is always on sectoral bargaining, which is critically important. But I just, like in a country like France, where the union density rate is so low, you never hear, of course you hear, okay, coverage is high, density is low, but what we aren't getting is, any attention on the fact that density is low as a problem that needs to be corrected through state policy or even beyond. Because at any rate, I just want to get your thoughts because I think it is more destabilizing for the country to have a low union density rate.
Sure.
And I think there's a greater risk of people like Marie Le Pen and other extremists surfacing. They have coverage, but they don't have union density. But anyway, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, I would be totally misunderstand if you took my talk as don't care about union density. Of course you have to care. And we saw in particular during the Euro crisis, I was talking before, there you had a situation where you suddenly had a strong attack from the state on the bargaining system. And since the union densities of these, especially the countries in Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, were so weak, and the unions were so weak, they do not have any power to defend the system. So they rely very much on that. So therefore, of course, it is de facto a problem if you have these low union densities. And it is also not, so it's not seen, you should not see it as an argument that you don't care about that. For me, the point was just to make clear that unions sometimes believe we only will get a big high density if we are strong. So, and I would say this is a certain way a myth because nobody in the world, it is just about unions creating this high density for them, but you always need a kind of cooperation with the state and state support in order to get such a system. That was just my argument. This was not, of course, union density is sort of important.
Yeah, no, I understand that these are two objectives that ideally you should pursue together. My question is, because you were first talking about the incentives, right, for workers to join unions,
Right.
and the wage premium is always one of those.
Right.
But if you have collective bargaining coverage that is set there by the state, doesn't that disincentivize workers to join unions and then backfires in the union density element?
That's of course the big question of the free rider problem in that many unions address. So if we have sectoral bargaining everywhere and you profit from the wage agreement, why should you become a union member? That's of course good. I come back to that, okay, in the third part, but I keep your question in mind, yeah.
Just a follow-up also. Is there evidence that collective bargaining coverage pushes the minimum wage standard or increases wages?
So if you look, I did not have that include that in my presentation, but if you look to the economic effects, so the most clear-cut effect is that collective bargaining have a more compressing effect on wages. So wage equality is much stronger though. So the difference between the ones on the bottom and the ones on the top are much lower. And systems with poor company bargaining have a much higher degree of inequality. And that means that especially the ones at the bottom of the wage scale, they got relatively seen higher wages within sectoral bargaining than the ones in the company bargaining system.
I'm wondering if you will, or if you can talk about the structural bargaining as well, because I think something crucially missing from union density and bargaining coverage is also how it's structured. For example, like Croatia is coming up fairly high on these charts, but almost 90% of collective bargaining coverage is in public sector and less than 30% is in private.
Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I absolutely agree. You could differentiate that from sector, especially this public sector. You see that picture, you see in many countries that the public sector had a very high coverage, and in the private sector it's much lower. You also might think that most of these systems with sectoral bargaining are also multi-level bargaining systems. So you have always an interaction between sectoral bargaining, but of course, additional company bargaining and so on. So all these things you should take in mind, and it would, of course, differentiate the picture. But I wanted to keep it simple in order to put out all the argument, in order to also to stick. I don't know how much time I still have, probably have, but in order to stick to the time scale. But yes, of course, you should take that into account. Anyway, so these are, this was again my rough conclusion so far. So in order to have a high bargaining coverage, you need sectoral bargaining, you need some form of state support. But I would say, and that was your argument, you should of course not forget about the union density. Union density plays an important role. If unions rely poorly on state support, that of course would create also big danger. And we saw that during the Euro crisis, that this could affect them dramatically when they are not able to defend their system. Yeah, this is also commercial. I put away. Yeah, this was just okay. Well, sorry. I'm sorry. I'm in the wrong direction. This is the right direction. Okay, now you see what's still coming. Now, this was just referring. If you're interested in any, but most of you will know already, in any particular bargaining system in Europe, there is really an excellent 4-volume book series of the European Trade Union Institute, covering all the 27 member states of the EU, and it has in particular excellent chapter on Germany. But no, of course, there are many interesting, and you have a similar thing also for trade unions themselves. It's a more recent book on trade unions in the European Union. Again, a very interesting chapter on Germany. And the good thing is it's all for free. You can free download everything at the E2I webpage. So that was the advertisement bank. So I come to the third part. So ways of implementation of the directive. So what does the what's about the directive? So first of all, the good thing about the directive is that I would say in almost all EU member states, the topic of collective bargaining coverage and how to agree is on the political agenda. And that's really something which already this directive has all the debate on this directive and its implementation had created that I would say almost all over Europe, with probably a few exceptions, especially the unions, but also other political forces, they took this directive and say, here, state, we have to do something. We have to set up a national action plan. What's your proposal? Here are our proposal. For instance, the German trade unions, they come up with I think a 20 bullet point list of things what they all want to have. So a kind of wishing list how to increase bargaining coverage in Germany. So the member states are now obliged to set up these concrete action plans until the end of the year. And I saw already some drafts of some member states, which are, I would say, so far mostly rather also very general and yeah, we want to do this and that, so not very concrete. So in the end, of course, the proper implementation of this directive depends almost entirely on the struggles at the national level. So it is not that, and that's probably also the limitations of this directive to show very clearly that it is not, in that sense, a classical directive where you really have to fulfill certain aims and certain norms, but it's more a kind of giving you a procedure, but what you make out of it and what you make not out of it depends in the end at the struggles at national level. And that's due to this difficult legal situation that probably if the EU would go further than what they did, then it would be, at least under the current status of the European Treaty, not be allowed to do that. Well, nevertheless, what can they do? What are the instruments? And I won't go through everything, but of course, to make a very rough distinguish, there are a lot of things under the discussion. One about the capacity building of the bargaining parties, of course, strengthening the unions, but also, and that's often an even larger problem, we have no sectoral employers association in many countries, especially in Eastern Europe, but also now that you need an employer. How to strengthen the employers association as well. And then, of course, the question how to reform and improve the political support, political and institutional support for sectoral bargaining. So just coming back to Jose's question about what are the incentives also to become union member, what you asked. For instance, one thing is, that's a big point in the German debate, for instance, at the moment, to agree a sectoral bargaining, but also to agree certain bonuses or certain additional things, additional free days or additional bonuses, which are exclusively only for union members, in order to have an incentive also to make to get union membership. So this is one thing what they discuss in order to tackle this free rider problem. And of course, I mean, to have sectoral bargaining is nice, but to have a good sectoral agreement. So I was not talking at all about the quality of these agreements itself, but where you need a strong union. That's also, a union always had to make sure that you can have weak unions negotiating through the setting sectoral agreements, but these agreements might be not very good, or even just regulating the almost the legal minima, so not really improving the things. So therefore, of course, you need the union. I think one big thing which is debated both in Germany but also at the European level and in some other countries is the relation between, let's say, very broadly, state money and social rights. So the whole idea about public procurement, but also industrial policy, how to link these whenever you give state money to companies, or you make public contracts with companies, that you say you will only give it to companies who would at least accept some social standards or even be part of the collective agreement. So here you may see a broad list of issues you might discuss. And of course, if you want to go into the debate, I will come lately maybe I'll say a few words about one proposal in the end, which is proposed now for the US, because that's, of course, also, I think, interesting thing. So I already come to the end before we have some thoughts about the US. And this is, of course, the picture you are very familiar with. This is the development of union density and also collective bargaining coverage in the US. You see that both are very close together, of course, in the US. And the interesting thing for me was, and I really got in this so-called aha effect when I saw that was, well, the US was, even in its high days, it was always a system for minority workers. So it only functioned for it was never a system where the mass or the bulk of workers were affected, only a minority. Even in its high days, it was about a third best of the workers who were affected. And maybe also there will be indirect factors for the non-coverage, of course, but nevertheless, and that is, of course, a fundamental difference to most, at least, Western European societies, where you have this idea or approach to say, well, our attempt is to have a system, a regulation which covers the majority of workers. So, and why is that? I think it's, for me, the US system shows very clearly to relying on organizing only I mean, Ian and me, we did a concrete study about a German company in the US called Fresenius, a health company. They're making these dialysis clinics. Dialysis clinic has about 20, 30, sometimes 50 workers. And I really understood through this concrete case how the American system is functioning, that these unions have to organize every of these single unions, these small single units. And I mean, and they have now, for instance, in California, they have organized 20 clinics, but there are a few hundreds clinics. So how to do that with which union should do that? How many resources you need to all these? So you see here, there are structural limits. And my guess of the US system is it functioned well in some very small, well-organized islands, especially in the big companies, of course, the big 3 car companies and so on. There you have a kind of quite reasonable union density, and there you got your agreement, but for the rest, it won't function. So I think it shows really the limits, and what I think is, based on that, a comprehensive system of collective bargaining needs sectoral bargaining and state support, even in the US. And what I found very interesting is, I think I looked to all the debates which you have in the US, and I was really astonished. I think I found, in the meantime, more than 50 articles, recent articles, both in academic journals, but also in political journals about sectoral bargaining in the US. So, and I think that's really a very important and good debate here. And I think probably one of the most advanced concept has been developed by the Harvard University, the Harvard Law School, called Clean Slate. And they had a broad, comprehensive approach on not only on collective bargaining, also on other aspects on how to develop and further develop the American industrial relations system. One of their basic and their core issue is, of course, the focus on sectoral bargaining. And since and their proposal is to say, whenever you have a certain threshold of organized workers in a sector, I think they talk about 10% or so is their suggestion, they should have the right to sectoral bargaining. So they should have the right to go to the state, either at state or at national level whatsoever, to ask to set up a sectoral bargaining committee. So the state has to set up this committee and therewith oblige employers to participate in it and be part of it. If that works out, I mean, at the moment, of course, we don't have to discuss the political situation, perhaps, and it's not very likely for the moment. But nevertheless, I found it quite really interesting that you have a lot of scholars in the US thinking about how to develop the system. I think this is a very important task. And my final slide is that I also want to remind you that if you really think about a little bit of the history of the American system, I found a very nice article of Robert F. Wagner, the name giver of the famous Wagner Act, who, by the way, comes from Germany. As a small child, he was coming with his family over to Germany from Germany. So he actually was still born in Germany, but then came to the US and became here a state senator, of course, and then the name giver. And in 1934, I found a very nice article of Wagner in the New York Times. So it was just half a year before the Wagner Act was adopted. And he was talking about, what is the New Deal philosophy and the idea of how to structure collective bargaining. And he was, as you see, very critical on a concept which that time was very much involved, the so-called company union. Company union was a union basically set up by management, so management-friendly, yellow union whatsoever. And he said, really, of course, this is totally against the New Deal philosophy, but he also go further and said, in order to regulate the wage question, you should go beyond the company. You even should cover entire industry, states, or even the nation. And if the workers are not able to organize beyond the company and to find ways of regulation beyond the company, then you probably won't get really a part in your share of the wealth which is produced. So I found it very interesting because it shows that the idea of the New Deal thinkers, even they went very much beyond what's in the end become the American system of poor enterprise bargaining. And in order to have a debate now on how to further develop and to reform, it would absolutely make sense also to look to the historical origin of the Wagner Act and about the way that they think about